In 2009, Randy Owen disappeared. No farewell tour, no announcement, just silence. The man whose voice had defined a generation of country music was gone, leaving millions of fans asking, what could make a legend vanish at the height of his fame? Rumors swirled, scandal, betrayal, or something far darker. The truth was even more shocking. Randy Owen was lying in a hospital bed in Mexico, fighting an enemy he had hidden from everyone, cancer. The very voice that had carried him from a dirt-poor Alabama farm to the pinnacle of American music was at risk of being silenced forever. How do you survive when everything you've built, everything you are, is under threat? And what does it take to rise again when the world thinks you're finished? This is the untold story of Randy Owen, the secret war behind the music. The man who refused to let silence win. The diagnosis they hid from the world. The headaches started small, dull throbs that came and went like distant thunder. Randy ignored them the way he had ignored every physical complaint for 40 years. He was a performer, a road warrior, a man who had spent decades pushing through exhaustion, illness, and injury because the show always had to go on. But these headaches were different. They lingered, they intensified, they brought with them a fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. Still, he kept touring. I kept recording, kept being the Randy Owen that America expected. The warm smile, the gentle voice. The man who made country music feel like home. Behind that smile, something was wrong. The dizziness came next. Moments when the world tilted without warning. Flashes of vertigo that struck mid-performance and forced him to grip the microphone stand just to stay upright. He hid it well. Decades of stagecraft had taught him how to mask pain, how to project confidence even when everything inside was screaming. But you cannot hide from your own body forever. The doctor's words landed like a hammer. Prostate cancer. 2 words that reframe everything. 2 words that force you to confront the fragility you have spent your whole life ignoring. For Randy Owen, a man who had built his entire existence around his voice, his presence, his ability to stand on a stage and move thousands of people with a single note, cancer was not just a medical diagnosis. It was an attack on everything that made him who he was. He had a choice to make. He could announce it publicly, let the world know what he was facing, accept the sympathy and support that would inevitably follow, or he could fight in private, protecting his family and his legacy from the circus that celebrity illness always becomes. Randy chose silence. He told almost no one. His wife Kelly knew, a few close friends, his bandmates. But the public, the fans, the industry that had made him famous, they were told nothing. One day, Randy Owen was everywhere. The next day, he was gone. And no one outside his inner circle knew why. He left Nashville and traveled to Mexico for experimental treatment. The irony was not lost on him. A man who had spent his life singing about home, about Alabama, about the red dirt roads and cotton fields that had shaped his soul, was now fighting for his life in a foreign country, far from everything familiar. The hospital room became his world. White walls, beeping machines, the smell of antiseptic that never quite faded, nurses who spoke in accents he strained to understand, and endless hours of treatment that left him weaker than he had ever been. During those long nights, Randy confronted questions he had spent 60 years avoiding. What would happen to Kelly if he did not survive? What would happen to his children? What would happen to the music, to Alabama, to the legacy they had spent decades building? And beneath all those practical concerns lurked a fear that was almost too painful to acknowledge. Would he ever sing again? The treatments ravaged him. His body, which had always been strong, which had carried him through thousands of performances and millions of miles on the road, now felt like a stranger. He lost weight. He lost energy. He lost the certainty that had always defined him. There were moments when he wondered if the fight was worth it. Moments when the pain seemed greater than any future the survival might bring. But Randy Owen had spent his entire life refusing to quit. He had grown up in poverty so deep that most people cannot imagine it. He had been rejected by Nashville for nearly a decade before finally breaking through. He had survived the brutal years when Wild Country played to empty bars and slept in their truck because they could not afford a bed. He had learned, long before cancer ever found him, that surrender is a choice. And he chose, even in his darkest moments, to keep fighting. Slowly, painfully, the treatments began to work. The cancer retreated, not defeated entirely, but pushed back, held at bay, forced into remission. When Randy finally returned to America, he was changed, thinner, older, marked by an experience that only those who have faced their own mortality can truly understand. But he was alive, and he had learned something in that Mexican hospital room that would shape everything that came after. Time is not infinite. The voice he had always taken for granted was a gift that could be taken away. Every performance from that moment forward would carry a weight it had never carried before. The world never knew how close they came to losing Randy Owen. He never announced the cancer publicly, never sought sympathy or made his battle part of his brand. He simply returned to music and kept singing, carrying a secret that only those closest to him would ever know. But the cancer was only the first battle. The wars that followed would test him in ways that even cancer had not prepared him for. The boy who came from nothing to understand what Randy Owen survived, you have to understand where he came from. And where he came from was as close to nothing as America gets. Fort Payne, Alabama in the 1950s was not the kind of place that produced legends. It was the kind of place that swallowed dreams whole and left people exactly where they were born. The Owen family worked a small cotton and cattle farm in DeKalb County. They were not poor in the way that middle-class people imagine poverty. They were poor in the way that means hunger. That means worn-out clothes passed down until they fell apart. That means choosing between necessities because you cannot afford them all. Randy U.L. Owen was born into this world on December 13, 1949. His parents worked from before sunrise until after dark, their hands rough and calloused from labor that never ended and never paid enough. But poverty could not kill everything. In the Owen household, two things survived no matter how hard times got: faith and music. Sunday mornings meant church, a small wooden building where the congregation gathered to sing hymns that had been passed down for generations. There were no professional musicians, no polished performances, just working people raising their voices together, finding in harmony a peace that their daily lives could not provide. Randy sat in those pews and felt something stir inside him. He did not have words for it yet, but he understood, even as a child, that music had power. Power to transform, power to heal, power to make a hard life bearable. At home, an old radio brought the voices of country legends into the Owen household. Hank Williams sang about loneliness and heartbreak. Lefty Frizzle crooned about love gone wrong. Jim Reeves delivered ballads smooth as honey. Randy absorbed it all. The melodies, the emotions, the way these men could take ordinary pain and spin it into something beautiful. His uncle owned a guitar. Nothing fancy, just a worn acoustic with strings that needed constant replacing. Randy borrowed it whenever he could. He sat on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the Alabama sun sink toward the horizon, teaching himself to play by ear. Nobody gave him lessons. Nobody told him he had talent. He simply played because playing felt as natural as breathing. But dreams cost money, and money was something the Owen family did not have. By 9th grade, the weight of poverty had become unbearable. School felt like a luxury when the farm needed every hand it could get. One day, without ceremony, Randy dropped out. He told himself this was simply reality. He would work the land like his father. He would marry a local girl. He would live and die within a few miles of where he was born. The music would remain a hobby, nothing more. What happened next changed everything. The principal of his school drove out to the Owen farm. He was a man who had watched Randy struggle and seen something beneath the surface that the boy himself could not see. He sat down with the teenager who had given up and spoke words that would echo through the rest of Randy's life. He told him that quitting now meant never knowing what he could become. He told him the world was bigger than Fort Payne. He told him some doors close forever once you walk away. Randy listened. Something shifted inside him. He returned to school. He studied. He pushed through, and in 1969, he became the first person in the Owen family to ever earn a high school diploma. That same year, fate intervened through family. Randy reconnected with his cousins Teddy Gentry and Jeff Cook. They were young men shaped by the same red dirt, burning with the same impossible dreams. When they played music together, magic happened. Their voices blended like they had been singing together their whole lives. Their instruments wove together into something that sounded like the South itself, given melody. In a barn on the Owen farm, 3 cousins made a promise. They would form a band. They would take their sound beyond the hills that had always contained them. They would make the world listen. They had no money, no connections, no realistic path to success. They had only talent, faith, and a stubbornness that would be tested to its breaking point. They called themselves Wild Country, and they set out to conquer America. The decade Nashville tried to break them. The 1970s nearly destroyed everything. For almost 10 years, Wild Country existed in a purgatory between ambition and oblivion. 3 young men from Alabama crammed into a pickup truck that broke down constantly, driving from town to town, searching for anyone willing to listen to their music. They played in bars where brawls erupted before the first set ended. They performed at county fairs, where the crowd cared more about carnival food than live entertainment. They spent countless nights in honky-tonks so empty, their own voices echoed off the walls. The money was pathetic when it existed at all. Sometimes they earned enough to fill the gas tank and grab a meal. Sometimes they earned nothing and went hungry. They slept in the truck because motels were luxuries they could not afford. They lived on instant noodles and gas station coffee, and the kind of desperate hope that either forges steel or shatters completely. Nashville should have saved them, the capital of country music, the place where dreams became reality. But Nashville in the 1970s was a fortress designed to keep outsiders exactly where they were. The industry was controlled by labels and producers with very specific ideas about what country music should sound like. Steel guitars, traditional arrangements, the same formulas that had worked for decades. Wild Country did not fit that mold. Their sound was different. Randy had grown up on country, but he had also absorbed rock and pop and gospel. When he sang, all those influences merged into something fresh, something that felt modern while honoring tradition. The gatekeepers of Nashville wanted nothing to do with fresh or modern. They wanted predictable and safe. The rejection was brutal and relentless. Labels refused meetings. Producers laughed at their demos. One executive told them flatly that nobody wanted country music that sounded like rock. Another suggested they return to Alabama and find real jobs. The message was unmistakable. The music industry had no room for three unknown boys with unconventional ideas. Most bands would have surrendered. Most bands did surrender. The 1970s were a graveyard of groups who chased the same dream and collapsed before reaching their destination. But Randy refused to accept defeat. He remembered what his father had taught him in those cotton fields. Hard work does not guarantee success, but quitting guarantees failure. So they kept working. They kept playing. They kept refining their sound. They accepted every gig, no matter how small or demeaning. They built a following, one fan at a time, one town at a time, one exhausting night at a time. And in 1977, after nearly a decade of grinding, something shifted. They scraped together enough money to record demo tracks in a proper studio. One song was called My Home's in Alabama. It was simple and sincere. A love letter to the land that raised them. But there was something in Randy's voice that made people stop and listen. A warmth and depth that could not be manufactured. When the right ears finally heard that recording, doors that had been sealed for years began to crack open. The glory, years, and the shadow behind the light. In 1980, the band renamed Alabama released their first major single. When My Home's in Alabama hit radio stations across the South, something unprecedented happened. Truck drivers pulled over to listen. Factory workers gathered around break room radios. Families sat together in living rooms, hearing a voice that somehow sounded like their own lives transformed into music. Randy did not sing like a distant star. He sang like a neighbor, like someone who understood their struggles because he had lived those same struggles himself. The song climbed the charts faster than anyone predicted. Then came Tennessee River. Then Feels So Right. Then Love in the First Degree. Then Mountain Music. Hit after hit, each carrying the sound of the American South to millions who had never heard anything quite like it. What made Alabama different was not marketing or gimmicks, it was truth. Randy sang about working-class pride because he had lived working-class hardship. He sang about faith because faith had carried him through years of rejection. He sang about home because home was not an abstraction, but a specific place with red dirt and cotton fields and sunsets that no painter could capture. When people heard his voice, they heard themselves. Throughout the 1980s, Alabama dominated country music in ways no band had before. They sold out stadiums previously reserved for rock acts. They appeared on television programs that had never featured country artists. They shattered records and rewrote rules about what country music could achieve. More than 40 #1 singles. More than 75 million albums sold. Three boys from nowhere had become the biggest band in country music history. But even at the peak, Randy never forgot the secret he carried. The cancer might be in remission, but the fear never fully disappeared. Every headache made him wonder. Every moment of fatigue triggered memories of that hospital room in Mexico. He had learned something that fame could not erase. Time is borrowed, not owned. Every performance could be the last. That knowledge gave his singing a depth it had not possessed before. But it also planted a seed of anxiety that would grow in the years ahead. Because the cancer had been only the first battle. The losses that followed would prove even more devastating. When everything fell apart, the deaths came one after another, relentless as waves breaking on stone. Randy's father passed first, the man who had taught him to work the land, who had hummed melodies in the cotton fields, who had shown him that dignity exists in labor and faith sustains through hardship. Gone, an empty chair at the family table that nothing could fill. Randy wrote a song called First Christmas Without Daddy. It was not designed for radio play. It was a wound set to music, a grieving son trying to make sense of absence. In 2022, his mother followed, the woman who had raised him in that modest farmhouse, who had sung hymns beside him in church, who had believed in his dreams when belief seemed foolish. Randy sat beside her casket in silence. After the funeral, he found an old recording of her voice. He played it alone, tears streaming down his face, whispering that she was singing somewhere higher now. Then came the loss that nearly broke him completely. Jeff Cook, his cousin, his bandmate, his brother in everything that mattered, had been battling Parkinson's disease for years. Randy watched helplessly as his friend declined, watched the hands that once danced across guitar strings lose their precision, watched the man who had stood beside him through every triumph and failure fade away. When Jeff finally passed, Randy stood at the funeral and said that half the music inside him had died. He was not exaggerating. The lawsuits made everything worse. After decades of brotherhood, Alabama became entangled in legal battles over royalties and contracts. Men who had once shared sleeping bags in a broken-down truck now faced each other in courtrooms. The media called it the end of a legend. Randy said only that when money enters a room, music exits. Then came 2019. Alabama's 50th anniversary tour was meant to be a celebration, a victory lap, a chance to thank the fans who had made everything possible. Instead, it became catastrophe. During a performance before 60,000 people, Randy collapsed. Chronic vertigo, severe migraines. For a singer, these conditions were devastating. He could not stand without the world spinning. He could not focus. He could not perform. Shows were canceled. Fans were sent home in silence. And Randy Owen, the voice that had made America stop and listen, walked off the stage into darkness. He later admitted what that moment felt like. He said he was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of the day he could no longer sing. In that terrible summer, it seemed that day had arrived. Finding peace. In the silence, the farm in Fort Payne became his sanctuary, the same land where he had learned to dream, where he had first touched a guitar, where he had made a promise with his cousins to conquer the world. Randy retreated there and let the silence wrap around him. His wife Kelly was there, patient and understanding, knowing her husband carried wounds no spotlight could heal. For months, he barely touched his guitar. The instrument that had been his companion for 50 years sat gathering dust. The thought of singing felt like pressing on a bruise. But something unexpected began to happen in the stillness. Randy started hearing music again, not the kind that fills stadiums. A different kind. The wind through cotton fields, grandchildren laughing in the yard, the creak of a rocking chair, the silence between heartbeats. One evening, as sunset painted the sky, he picked up his guitar. His fingers were stiff, his voice uncertain. But he played anyway. A simple melody, a few whispered words. Tears rolled down his face, but he kept playing. It was not performance, it was prayer. He filled notebooks with songs meant for no audience except his own soul. Songs about his father and mother, about Jeff, about the land that gave him everything, about loss and grace, and the strange peace that comes when you finally stop running. The charity work never stopped. Country Cares for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital had raised over $800 million under his leadership. When asked about this legacy, Randy refused credit. He said those children saved him. They taught him what it truly meant to sing through pain. Slowly, he returned to public life, not with grand announcements, with quiet appearances at the Grand Ole Opry, memorial events where old friends gathered. When Randy stepped onto those stages, there were no pyrotechnics, just a man with a guitar, singing songs that had become part of America's identity. And stripped of spectacle, the music felt more powerful than ever. Randy Owen once said he had lived his whole life to sing, but finally learned that sometimes silence is a song too. After cancer, after loss, after the moment his body failed him in front of 60,000 people, he found what he had been searching for since that skinny boy first picked up a borrowed guitar. Not applause, not fame. Peace. The peace that comes when you have nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide. On quiet evenings in Fort Payne, locals say you can still hear his voice drifting through the hills. Not from speakers or stages, from the wind itself, as if the music has become part of the land that created it. If Feels So Right ever made you smile, if My Home's in Alabama ever made you proud, if mountain music ever made you believe anything was possible, then Randy Owen is still singing for you. His voice lives in your memory. His music lives in your soul. And that song will never end. Which Randy Owen moment changed your life? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe so we can keep telling the stories of legends who shaped who we are.